Are you working now? Excellent. So, good evening, everyone. I've posted the link for those who aren't here for the handouts. If you just click on the link, you should be able to see the handouts, and I'll put it on the YouTube recording also. So, unfortunately, we've had a little bit of an interrupted sessions, and we're a little bit further behind than we probably should be. So, we're going to try in the time available, and I have to leave a little early because of Baruch Hashem Simcha. We'll try and whiz through chapter Beis and chapter Gimel of Ezra. That's today's ambitious goal. So to contextualize this, just remember, in the previous chapter, we learnt about Koresh and the Mashiach Hashem, the incredible sense of mission that either he felt or he should have felt, but he was acting as the redeemer of the Jewish people, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and allowing the return of Klal Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, and as we will see, ultimately even a rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. We also saw last time that this didn't proceed smoothly. It started and stopped. There was a cancellation of Koresh's plan, and then it was renewed by Daryovesh, and there were at least two waves of Aliyah, of return to Eretz Yisrael, under the first leadership of Zerubbabel, and then under the second leadership of Ezra and Nechemia. And we looked at some of the sort of historical context of that. Now, chapter Beis, I printed part of chapter Beis, and on page 1 of the source sheet. I printed, 13 psukim out of a very long chapter of 70. And basically, the content of the chapter is listing families, their locations where they came from in Eretz Yisrael, and that these are the individuals that returned to Eretz Yisrael when the opportunity was given to come back from Golus under the decree of Koresh and move back to Eretz Yisrael. And all I really want to do is just highlight a number of features from this Perek. So the first thing to notice is that the sum total of those who come back is about 42,000. So it's a relatively small population. And this is one of the things that we explored a little bit in previous weeks, that most of Klal Yisrael say, we're in Bavel, we've settled there, this is our new home, and they don't take the opportunity to move back to Eretz Yisrael. The second thing to notice, I'm not going in any particular order here, is that there are very few Leviim who come back. So if you have a look in Psukim 40, 41, 42, the Leviim that come back are about 200 in total, and they are split into the Meshorim, who are the singers, and the Shoarim, who are the gatekeepers. I don't want to go too much into details about this, but when one learns the Chelek of Kodshim in Gemara and Mishnayos, it becomes apparent that, broadly speaking, the Leviim have two tasks. They are split into Meshorim and Meshorim. The Meshorim are the singers; they sing the Shira whilst the Avodah is taking place, and the Meshorim, from the root of Sha'ar, a gate, are the gatekeepers, and they're the ones who do all the other assistant functions of the Leviim. Why are there so few Leviim? We don't really know. But it is a historical fact that to this day, there are relatively few Leviim, less than their percentage of the population that we should think they should be. We would expect the Leviim to be at least 1 in 12 of the Jewish population, or even more than that, given that we really are just descendants of Yehuda and Binyamin. So just a quick reminder, but the Jewish kingdom split in the generation after Shlomo HaMelech, Rehoboam and Yerovam, into two kingdoms. Broadly speaking, one kingdom had 10 tribes and the other kingdom had 2 tribes, Yehuda and Binyamin. And the kingdom of the 10 tribes, so-called Yisrael, was exiled by Sancherev and was more or less lost to history, the so-called lost 10 tribes. Though we'll see a little bit more about that today. And 2 tribes survived, from whom are the descendants of the Jewish people nowadays. We took the name Yehudim at that point because Yehuda was the dominant Shevet. Now Levi also survived, so based on that, we could even expect that the Leviim should be a third of the Jewish population.
The Leviim who lived among the 10 tribes would have been lost with 10 tribes.
So it's not clear if that's the case or not, but either way, we would expect the statistics either to be a third or a 12th, and they're considerably less than that. Notoriously, Leviim get lots of aliyahs because they're disproportionate for their numbers. Okay, this is already reflected in Nechemia. We don't know why. Is it that the population of Leviim had already fallen? Is it that in Golus, Levium's yichus became confused. It is a fact that Kohanim preserved their yichus because they had unique halachas, bechas Kohanim. Levium, in the length of exile, perhaps more easily lost their yichus. So with all the movements and travails and troubles of backwards and forwards and so on, it may well be that Levium lost their yichus. There is also a complicated episode in Sefer Yecheskel, which I'm not going to go into today, in which Yecheskel reserves particularly sharp criticism for the Levium, who he says seem to have failed in their responsibilities, and he pushes them away quite strongly. And according to some ways of understanding the Pesukim, he takes away some of the privileges and rights of the Levium and gives them to the Kohanim and so on. So it's possible that the Levium felt disenfranchised and, or perhaps for some reason or other, had taken their status as a type of nobility too far and become less than 100% loyal Jews, and therefore a lower percentage of them were minded to return to Eretz Yisrael. It is also a fact that in Sefer Ezra, it appears to be the case that there are less Kohanim also. We only are aware of a handful of Kohanim who came back, which is very, very interesting. Ezra HaSof himself is a Kohen. One of the leaders of the Jewish people who we'll look at more fully in today's episode, in today's share, was someone called Yeshua ben Yehotzadok HaKohen. He was the leader of one of the leaders of the Jewish people. He became the future Kohen Gadol. But basically, there's very little mention of Kohanim at all. And it would appear, again, we don't know entirely, but it appears from the little fragments of clues in Tanakh that the Kohanim were disproportionately massacred by Bovel, by Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan, and the various generals of Bovel. By the way, the generals of Bovel are referred to in Nach. We'll see later some Sukkim as Tabach, as the butchers. they were violent individuals, and it would appear that the Kohanim were massacred out of proportion to their numbers. Perhaps that's also what happened to the Levium, but it does look like there's a scarcity of Kohanim and Levium at that point in Jewish history, and that's one thing that I want to point out about the genealogy. Now, as I've mentioned, there's 70 Pesukim in this very long chapter, and basically it lists the families of those who came back. Why? Because, first of all, they're granted chashivas, that Tanakh gives them credit. These are the remarkable individuals who chose to come back to Eretz Yisrael. Secondly, and I mentioned this in previous weeks, one of the pursuits of Ezra seems to have been to clarify yichus, clarify Jewish status, and indeed we'll see shortly Kohen status. This is, I mentioned, as one of the themes of perhaps the commonality between the return to Zion, the return to Zion then, and the return to Zion now, is that with all the chaos of Golus, one of the jobs of the Botei Din is to clarify actually who has Jewish status. So like nowadays, tragically, Jewish people can come from Russia, and it can be very hard to work out after 100 years behind the Iron Curtain what their halachic status is, or perhaps Jews who have even been distant from the Jewish people for 500 years, descendants of the Anusim in Spain and the like. And this is a whole complicated halachic topic, how to deal with this. The same phenomena is occurring in Bovel and Eretz Yisrael, as Jews are returning from Bovel to Eretz Yisrael and need to establish Jewish status. What's remarkable here is that the length of Golus is relatively tiny. So we're dealing with, sadly, 2,000 years of Golus, 500 years of Golus. There are people who are distanced from the Jewish people even longer than 500 years, the Anusim. There's communities that claim Jewish descent, and we really don't know what to do with this exactly. In Ethiopia, who are perhaps 800 years of separation from the Jewish people, groups in India and the like. So there's swathes of population that we're really grappling with. How do we deal with? How long is this return from Golus? Well, not even 72 years. Again, in my first two sessions, when I was accused of looking too much at technical dates and details, one of the things we saw is that actually the first wave of return is perhaps only 52 years, depending on how you crunch the numbers. And maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter, but we're not talking about a massive length of Golus. And nonetheless, things have been lost in that time. And let me just draw your attention to a number of Pesukim. Let's look at Pasuk Samach Beis 62. Which for some reason I put in bold in the English, but not in the Hebrew. I'm just again posting the link for those online, and please, those who will watch this on YouTube, look at the link there. We could look at actually at 61. Umin b'nei ha-kohenim, and it lists the children of the Kohenim. Then Pasuk Samach Beis, Pasuk 62, Eile bikshu k'sovam ha-misyachsim. They sought to register their yichus, their genealogy. By the way, this is a feature of Lashon HaKodesh in Aramaic, that many words that we know with a samach in Ezra are written with a sin. So misyachsin is the same word as yichus. V'lo nimtzu, they couldn't find their yichus. Vayigalu, and they were. This is not exile. This is gaal. They were deemed polluted. It says in English, minakona. They were removed from the kola. And the Jewish leader at the time, Tishasa, we don't know exactly who Tishasa is, though we will see a source later that will suggest who he was. Either way, Tishasa says that they shouldn't eat from the most holy things till there will be the restoration of Jewish status through the Urim V'Tumim. What does it mean they shouldn't eat from the most holy things? It could be, and halach l'maisa, this may be the case, that a kohen who has some claim to kohuna status but not provable yichus can eat truma but not kodshim. So I'm not going to go into the technical details on this, but the tithes, the truma that's granted to kohenim, which is a very severe prohibition for a zar, a non-kohen, to eat, nonetheless may be mutter to a kohen if there's some degree of proof of the yichus, but they wouldn't be allowed to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. What would be the logic of the distinction? Truma is a private issur, as it were, it's my private prohibition. So if I believe I'm a kohen, or if rules of general halacha like rov and so on establish that I'm a kohen, then I can eat the truma. Kodesh kadoshim, eating the kodshim, serving the Beis Hamikdash, is kapara for the baidim, for those who have donated the korbanos or doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash on behalf of Klal Yisrael. There you need a kohen miyuchas who can prove their ancestry, and these kohenim can't eat from the Kodesh Kodashim. So what we see here is an example of the research project, the Yichus project of Ezra, or those that preceded him, in trying to clarify the Yichus status of those who are returning to Eretz Yisrael. Also mentioned on that note are the Nesinim. Have a look at Pasuk 43. So the Nesinim are a very interesting group of individuals. These are the so-called Givonim or Gibites. All the way back in the dawn of Jewish history in Sefer Yeshua, this is a Canaanite nation that makes a dubious peace with the Jewish people. The episode is a complicated one, but they dress up and pretend to be coming from a far land and sign a peace treaty with the Jewish people. It was an incorrect peace treaty because, in fact, they were from the 7 Canaanite nations for whom the terms of a peace treaty would have been more stringent. Nonetheless, even though they were duped and tricked, the Jewish leadership, Klal Yisrael, felt a responsibility to not break the peace treaty, and they were allowed to remain as citizens in Eretz Yisrael, albeit second-class status. And they, it seems, lived in the first Beis Hamikdash era, throughout the first Beis Hamikdash era, were exiled together with the Jewish people. They were Jews, they had become Gerim of some sort, and came back. Some of them came back with the waves of returns to Eretz Yisrael and continued to have Nesin status. I'm not aware of anyone nowadays who has Nesin status, meaning to say that sometime during the second Beis Hamikdash era and with the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, we lost the tradition as to who has that status, or perhaps they left the Jewish people, we don't know, but we're not aware of anyone who has that halachic status. They are mentioned, by the way, in Pasuk Ayin, in Pasuk 70, and we'll come back to that Pasuk later. I'll also draw your attention to Pasuk 55, the B'nai Avdei Shlomo, the children of Solomon, Shlomo's servants. So Shlomo, as we know, became somewhat of an emperor. He became a very powerful king, and he seems to have captured or had sent to him, as was the practice in the ancient world, servants from other nations who remained there living in Eretz Yisrael as non-Jewish citizens of Eretz Yisrael. They had their own unique halachic status. They're not halachically Jewish, but nonetheless were allowed to remain in Eretz Yisrael. Possibly wrong of Shlomo to have accepted these individuals, but they remain in the living amongst the Jewish people. And again, they seem to come back from Bavel into Eretz Yisrael. Yes, Dan?
So this is about genealogy.
Yes.
And being able to kind of like a statement reset.
Yes. Yes.
So is that the same point for the Sinan and the children of the slaves of Shlomo?
Yes.
In effectively saying that these people are Jewish and these people aren't.
Correct. It's categorization. Exactly right. Categorization, Kohanim, who are Jewish, but maybe not Kohanim, maybe yes Kohanim. Leviim, who for some reason or other have felt disenfranchised, or a bit disenfranchised. And then Nesinim, who are Jewish, but with a unique Yichus halachic status. and then Bnei Avdei Shlomo, who maybe are not halachically Jewish at all. That's exactly what's going on. This is a project of trying to clear up yichus, to clear up Jewish status.
But have they gone through Gerus? Well, previously, in which case does that then, is it being invalidated?
So we think of Gerus nowadays as black and white. Either it is a Gerus or it's not a Gerus, and you have a clear status. On rare occasions, someone may have an unclear status. Was there Gerus Lishma? Was it not Lishma? How legitimate was it, and so on. In truth, we avoid these shilas nowadays by either not accepting a ger or accepting a ger, and we want things clear cut. So we have full halachic status or non-Jewish status. In reality, however, there are more in between stages in which there's quasi status. So, for example, the Rambam distinguishes between a ger tzedek and a ger. So nowadays, anyone who becomes a ger is a ger tzedek or gior tzedek, a righteous convert. But there was a status of someone who became halachically Jewish, but not perhaps for the right reasons or not with the fullest of intentions, or we're not sure. And there's a lot of ink spilt as to exactly what this means in halachic categorization. Is this a halachic categorization of a sophic ger that's a question of doubt? Or is there some in-between status? These things are a little unclear. Just think about the Shavua story, the Rus story. We spoke about this a little bit then at the time. Machlon and Chilion marry these Moabite princesses. Did they marry them as non-Jews or as Jews? Who were these Moabite princesses? Had they undergone gior or not? So on the one hand, say that they didn't undergo gior, Machlon and Chilion would marry non-Jewish princesses, very, very difficult. More than that, the whole story is a story about Rus doing a yibum of sorts, a levirate marriage, a restoration of the family line of Elimelech, of Machlon and Chilion. If she wasn't Jewish, in what way was her Gerus, in what way was this a marriage at all? In what way was there any continuation? This was an intermarriage that we're continuing through marriage bros. In what way is she even part of the family? So presumably there is a Gerus. If there is a Gerus, then why is Naomi trying to push Rus and Arpa away? And we learned the halachas of Gerus from that she tries to push them away. And the answer is that Naomi is unsure about their status. They are in a status of sophic Gerus, and she's trying to determine Lamashreya retroactively whether this was a good Gerus or not. So there's all these different statuses. The Sinim are treated as having Jewish status, but nonetheless a yichus or halachic categorization of their own. Yeah.
I believe that when Mashiach comes, one of his very important functions will be to sort out all these.
Exactly right, and we exactly, and again, this is part of the point I'm making, which is when we are undergoing in some shape or form a return to Tzia nowadays, Baruch Hashem, in an amazing way. But ultimately, we aspire to the proper return to Tzia and to Mashiach, and part of the job will be Biru Yochsin. Eliyahu will be given that role of clarifying Yochsin, and there's a discussion in the Mishnah, to what degree will they dig things up, or if someone's already become Huchzak in a halachic assumption status as being a kosher Jew, then that would be sufficient. All of this is sort of part of what needs to be done when Klal Yisrael settle back in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Shel Yisrael, it's the land of Yisrael. And to be Eretz Yisrael with its fullest Kedusha, you need Klal Yisrael living in Eretz Yisrael, everyone in their own place. That's why there's the whole parsha is about settling people back in their Shefotim and there'll be another Chalukas Oret. There is a type of Biru Yochsin that takes place before they go into Eretz Yisrael. Think of the story that we just read about the Mekalel, which is the person who does or doesn't belong to Shevet Don, just this week, etc., and they feel excluded from the Machaneh. So part of creating a Jewish society is everyone working in sync with all the Shevatim and everyone knowing their place, and then in Eretz Yisrael settling that, and then the difficult position of those who don't fit into categories neatly. All of this is part of sort of settling Eretz Yisrael. Has to be a physical settling, but also has to be a spiritual settling. Part of that is sort of Ishal Machaneh of Ishal Diglo, everyone in their rightful place. Let's have a look actually at this point. There's much more I want to say about this, but let's pause briefly and I'll just show you the Mishnah in Kedushin. And the Mishnah makes this point explicitly. Asura Yuchsin Olu Mibovel. 10 categories of lineage ascended from Bovel. So this is page 2 in the source sheet, source 3. A Mishnah in Kedushin. 10 categories of yichus, of lineage, ascended from Bovel to Eretz Yisrael. That's talking about the ascent of the Ezra ascent. And now it lists them: Kohanim and Leviim and Yisraelim. Chalolim are Kohanim who have lost their Kohana status because against halacha they married a divorcee or someone they weren't allowed to marry. Geirim, Charori, which means avodim meshacharim, freed servants. These are all halachically Jewish. Mamzeri, the Mamzer and the Sini who were mentioned. These are the Givites who we just spoke about. Shtuki Valsufi, who are people where we don't know the parentage or their foundlings, etc. So these are various halachic statuses, and Ezra clarifies the status. Have a look at the next source, which is a Gemara in Kedushin a little later. Om Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol haratzos Isa Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael Isa leBovel. All the lands are as dough to Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael is as dough to Bovel, meaning to say that the yichus in all lands is like dough. It's blurry, it's mixed up, it's a muddle. In modern speak, which it's a cholent, right? It's a stew. It's all mixed up. In Mishneh, Hebrew, Aramaic, they say that it's an isa, it's a dough, it's a complete mixture to Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael has had some degree of biri yichus, and Eretz Yisrael is an isa to Bovel. Eretz Yisrael is a dough to Bovel. In other words, Bovel has an even better yichus status than Eretz Yisrael. And here we come to the next point, which is why are these Nesinim, why are these B'nai Avdei Shlomo ascending to Eretz Yisrael? And one understanding of it is that Ezra wants them to go to Eretz Yisrael so that he can monitor them. Bovel is in Golus. He's scared about Yichus getting confused there. He brings them back to Eretz Yisrael so they can be tracked. So perhaps Ezra is dafka deliberately bringing back these Yuchsin in order to clarify things in Eretz Yisrael, and thus you arrive at this paradox that Bovel has a better Yichus status than Eretz Yisrael, because everything is in Bovel has all problematic lineages have been removed from Bovel and have gone to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so this is a talk about the Yichus. Let me just share with you a couple more sources around this. Let me show you a Malbim, a very interesting couple of Malbims. So this is again on page 2.
1, 2, and 4.
Yeah, just want to show you one particular one.
No, that's Malachim. Oh, no. We might need to go to specs.
Yeah. Have you got any more sheets?
Yeah, sorry, I've got them all. Yeah, sorry, do I have something? I apologize. At the back there is, yes. Okay, let me actually turn to the last Malbim, which is the top of page 3 in source 6. I'm sorry that the source sheets are small. So I'm doing this out of order because we took them out of order. So I remind you here of Pasuk 63. 63 discusses the figure of Tirshasa, who says to the Koyanim, you haven't managed to prove your Yichus status, your lineage, and therefore you'll have to wait until the Urim V'Tumim can clarify your status. Okay, so again, on page 1, we looked at the whole of Ezra chapter 2 in summary, and we saw that the Kohanim status is unclear, and this figure known as Tarshasar, this is Pasuk 63, Samech Gimel, they are told we can't clarify your Yichus, wait till the Urim V'Tumim come. Now, the Malbim points out, first of all, he says, who is this Tarshasar? He says this is Nechemia. We're not going to go into the history of this and changing names, and we discussed in a previous session why Chazal sometimes look at very different figures, and they say this figure is identical to that figure. Do they mean it literally as a historic fact? Because it's not improbable that a figure like Nechemia had a Jewish name and also a Persian name. He's after all a Persian minister of state. Or do they mean it figuratively that this is a figure that's similar in status to this other leader? They achieve similar things. Either way, the Malbim says, in the second Beis Mikdash, they never got an Urim V'Tumim. Let's have a look at the Mishnah in the Gemara in Yoma. This is at the top of page 3. There are 5 differences between the first temple and the second temple. Oron, there was no ark. Kaporas, there was no Oron cover. Keruvim, there were no cherubs and no Keruvim. Aish, their fire didn't come down from the heavens and burn the karbonos. They had to manually light the Mizbeach. Shekhinah, there was no presence of the divine presence. Ruach HaKodesh, there wasn't the divine spirit. In other words, prophecy came to an end. And I think we've discussed in previous settings the cessation of prophecy. Urim V'Tumim, and for our purposes, there is no Urim V'Tumim. What is the Urim V'Tumim? A rather mysterious device that sat in the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol in a fold, and included Shemus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and caused the stones to light up and communicate. It was a form of divine communication that the Kohen Gadol had access to. And the Pasuk tells us this is a mystical thing, but it's not. These are not Kabbalistic sources. These are Pesukim that describe the building of the Kenim and describes the concept of asking the Urim v'Tumim. In fact, the very meaning of the word Urim v'Tumim may mean this idea: Urim as in light, v'Tumim, and Tum, perfection or perfect advice. So interpretation. So in the first Beis Hamikdash, there was an Oren. Second Beis Hamikdash, there was no Oren. What was there in the Kodesh Kodashim? Just the Even Shasiyah, the stone on which the Oren rested, the foundation stone, but no Oren itself. No Oren, no Ark, no Coven, no Keruvim, no presence of the Shekhinah, whatever that means, no fire coming down from the heavens, and no Nevuah. And linked to that, lack of prophecy, is also the loss of the prophetic ability of the Choshen to be a means of communicating. What would the Choshen do when it could communicate? It would, for example, assist the king in the decision whether to go to war. Famously, the Shaul story. Shaul had killed the Kohanim in Noiv, and therefore he was unable to consult the Kohen Gadol whether he should go to war or not, and he wrongly consulted the witch in the story of Ein Dor. And one of the jobs of the Urim Tumim we see in this parsha is to clarify yichus, to clarify genealogy. There is no Urim Tumim in the second Beis Hamikdash. Points out the Malbim in source 6 that evidently they didn't yet realize that. So when we read Pasuk 63, we read it with some sadness. The Jewish leader saying to the Jewish people, to the Kohanim, I'm sorry, we haven't been able to clarify your yichus status. Let's wait till Urim and Tumim comes back, and then we'll sort things out. And they're still optimistic that they could get back on Urim and Tumim. They don't manage to achieve that. One of the sad themes underlying Ezra is that they return with this great sense of optimism. They're dreaming about rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash, and everything's going to be back like it was, and it wasn't. Only 42,000 come back. The Jewish state is vulnerable still, and these are things that we're going to explore. And the Beis Hamikdash is never restored to its former glory, and it doesn't have all these features. So I find this Malbim very moving and sad. Jewish leaders turning to the Kohanim and saying, well, don't worry, we'll ask the Urim Tumim and we'll work this out. And unfortunately, that never happens to them. That's the point that the Malbim makes in source 6. We won't have a look at it inside. Okay, so we've looked at Yichus, genealogy, Kohanim, Leviim, Nesinim, Bnei Shloma, and the tragic non-restoration of the Urim Tumim. We've looked at the things that are lacking and how Ezra does this project of trying to bring over anyone who's problematic to Bavel. I really want to make several more points, all of which were drawn to my attention by the Malbim. I have to confess, I learned through these Pesukim, completely missed the point of everything, and then thank God we have the Malbim who clarified us. And the Malbim says something that's remarkable and outstanding, and I completely didn't understand this or notice this or realize this. When you look at the Pesukim, and I put in enough Pesukim for you to get a flavor of this, what the Pesukim are actually saying is that people and families are returning to Eretz Yisrael, and they know still where they came from in Eretz Yisrael, and they go back to where they came from. In other words, they're optimistic that they're going to be able to resettle these areas, and they settle a very wide swathe of Eretz Yisrael. Now, in the event this doesn't work out, the real second Commonwealth, as it's referred to, the restoration of a Jewish kingdom in Eretz Yisrael, is very small. It's a rump state. It's really Yerushalayim and the regions. It's just the center of the country. And it's only near the end of the second Beis Hamikdash era that they begin spreading further. And the Herodian kings conquer larger parts of Eretz Yisrael, Hashmonaim, and then the Herodian kings. And Eretz Yisrael sort of expands back somewhat closer to its original borders. Even then, it never achieves its full original borders. But at least initially, they're all going back to their little villages and towns all over the place. And it's not so simple because they're very few in number. So they've gone from being a large population, they're ending up as 2 or 3 in each village and each town. Not so easy. How long has passed? Only 52 years. So unlike the return now, people still know where they come from and they're going back home. Originally in the earlier Golas, we don't know exact numbers, but it's clear from the Pesukim we're looking in hundreds of thousands. And over 50 years of peace in Bovel, and Bovel and Persia they had a good life most of the time, despite the Haman story. Most of the time they're flourishing. So we think the population has already grown to 1 million, perhaps something like that. So this is a tiny population that's returning. I don't want to go too much into secular sources. When I first looked at this episode, this Parsha, maybe 20 years ago or so, all secular sources, and I know the Jews didn't go back to the whole of Eretz Israel. Since then, there's been archaeological finds, which, and we shouldn't need this, we should have everyone in Tanakh. Since then, there have been archaeological finds that shows that there were Jewish settlements throughout the lands of Israel, at least in the early days before they realized this wasn't going to work and the project shrunk back in. One of the very interesting developments in archaeology. But let me just draw your attention to just some of the psukim. Have a look at Pasuk Lamed Gimel 33, Bnei Lud, the children of Lud. Pasuk 34, Bnei Yerichai, the children of Yerichai. And I don't know if I put any other, Pasuk Nun Tes, Ve'ela ha'olim et Tel Melech, Tel Chasha, Kruv Eden Ima, etc. It lists all sorts of places where they came from, and they couldn't tell exactly what their halachic status was, who their father's houses were, whether they were of Israel, etc.
Presumably all of these would have been from what was the kingdom of Yehuda, Judah.
Oh, a very, very wise and interesting point. Okay, are all of these from the kingdom of Yehuda, or some of these from Yisrael? And we'll get to that point. The Malbim makes that point shortly. Okay. Have a look in Pasuk 42. Bnei Ashorim, the gatekeepers. Bnei Shalom, Bnei Oter, Bnei Talmon, Bnei Akuv, Bnei Chatita, Bnei Shovai. Okay, you have to look at a map, and work out where all of these are. But these are returning from all sorts of places and locations. How many cities of the Nevi'im were there, by the way? 42 plus 6, so 48 or 42, depending on how you do the count. Okay, if 300 odd people return to 48 cities, how many in each city? Not many. Okay, you're a mathematician, you can tell me more. Yeah, a handful of people in each city. So you can see this project isn't going to work in exactly the way it's meant to. This is a mess, and that's part of the confusion of the return from Velos. We now come to the Malbim in source 1 at the top of page 2, and he begins exploring David's point, and I find this Malbim in conjunction with another source that we'll see in a few minutes also very, very moving. And basically the Malbim says, again, I don't want to go into too many technical details, but there's a very similar chapter in Nechemia chapter 7, in which it describes a wave of returnees, somewhat similar to this, but with different numbers and slightly different descriptions. And the numbers are not compatible. There's some families more, some families less. The numbers don't fit. And basically, the Malbim has a theory, a double-edged theory. The first theory is that there are two waves of, well, this isn't the theory. The Nach describes us that there were two waves of exile. Those that were exiled with Nechemia, and then those that were exiled later. And Nach also describes two waves of returns, as we've seen when we looked at the analysis of the Pesukim. There's the return under Koresh, there's return under Daryavish, there's return under the leadership of Zerubbabel, there's return under the leadership of Nechemia. There's several ways out and several ways back. And basically, the Malbim argues that one return was centered from people who are actually in Bovel. Bovel is core Babylonia, the capital city. They are the wealthy elite. And the second return are those who live in the empire of the region, Poras and Modai and Bavel, who are living in more outlying areas, and they are the more poor, simple people. And he argues that this also matches the exiles, because in the first wave of exile from the first Beis Mikdash, who was taken to exile? The nobles. That's what the Pesukim tell us, including figures like Daniel and perhaps Mordechai and others, figures who are nobles, who are leaders. Where are they taken? To the king's palace. The first wave of exile, Asher Haglas, Yerushalayim, etc., are Yerushalayimites. We read about that in Megillas Esther, who are taken to the king's palace. The king he doesn't want to wreck the whole of Eretz Israel. He wants the Jewish population to remain subservient, but to be part of his empire. You don't exile a mass population when you want to run an empire. You leave them there. You try and slice off the head. So you take off the Jewish leadership. So he exiled the noble class. Where do you take nobles? Certainly in the ancient world, you take them to your capital and you treat them as nobility in the new location. You just try and assimilate them and make them loyal. This carries on, by the way, throughout the ancient world. Romans gave respect to kings and princes from captured houses. They brought them to Rome and treated them as kings, subservient, but as nobility. This goes all the way through the medieval era and so on. So the first wave of exile are the nobles of the Jewish people who are taken to the center of Bovel, where they enter the sort of aristocratic circles in Bovel. The second wave of exile, which is when the Bavliim realize, Nebuchadnezzar realizes he can't subjugate these pesky Jews, and he has to export and exile whole swathes of the population. These are the Hamonam, these are the masses, and they're exiled all over. They're not taken to the capital city. Why on earth should be taken to the capital city? They have to make their way in Bavel wherever they end up. So this is the thesis of the Malbim. There's no direct proof for this, but it definitely fits the Psukim well. And therefore he says this is the distinction between the two counts. Let's just have a look briefly in source one. Let's have a look at the bold letters in source one. So we're the third line. Kfi hanira, he says, I'm speculating, it would appear. This is source one at the top of page 2. Kfi hanira, I'm speculating. Kan medaber min hachashuvim. Here we're talking about the chashuv people, the prestigious ones. She'olu mi Bovel atzma. They came back from Bovel itself. So in the description here in Ezra chapter 2 of those who are coming back from Bovel itself, and these are people who are the elite. Ki begolus Yechonia higlas hasorim v'tovei ha'om. In the exile of Yechonia, the princes and the nobles of the people are exiled. V'osom higla le'ir ha'malucha. Those are exiled in the capital city, the Malchus, the royal city. V'otomid b'chavod, they remained with respect. Avol golus Sidkio, but then the second wave of Sidkio, Higla Medina, they were taken to the provinces. These were the shuffle, the low individuals, the commoners. And this, he says, explains, if you look in the Psukim, the language that's used, and the two waves, and the different numbers, etc., etc. Okay, so this is another point to make in Ezra chapter 2. We're talking about one wave of exile and perhaps a different class of people who are coming back. Source 2 in the Malbim speaks about the servants of Shlomo. I'm not going to go through that inside. Source 5 we'll look at now comes from the Radak. And here this is type of an aside, but it ties into what we've just been speaking about. And I put this here because, like David, I was wondering the same thing, which is, does this include any members of the 10 tribes? What actually happens to the 10 tribes? Where did they go? So there is a fascinating pasuk in source 5, which is in Melachim 2, chapter 23, pasuk Yotes, in which it's talking about Yoshio HaMelech. So Yoshio HaMelech is one of the latter Jewish kings of Yehuda, of the Davidic dynasty. The main kingdom of the 10 tribes has already been destroyed, and he tries to restore the Jewish people back to good spiritual health. Okay, so let me just, to avoid confusing all of us, we're now back at the end of the second Beis Hamikdash era, the dying days of the Davidic kingdom. The 10 tribes have already been exiled by Sancherev, they've already gone off. You've now got just the rump kingdom, sadly, of Yehuda and Binyamin, and things are on the decline. And Yoshio is a last flicker of light and hope in those dark days, and he tries to lead a mass teshuvah process. He's ultimately unsuccessful, and the kingdom continues to decline, but he tries to lead a mass teshuvah repentance process and restore the kingdom back to where it's meant to be. Now, in the Pasuk, it describes how he goes around destroying the bomos. The bomos are altars, high places, made for pagan worship. And he goes around destroying these bomos. Where does he go around? Look in the Psukim, explicitly in the Psukim, destroying them across the length and breadth of Eretz Yisrael. Asks the Radak, why is he destroying them the length and breadth of Eretz Yisrael? He is only the king of Yehuda. The rest of the land, I thought, was under Assyrian rule, Sancherev, and has been cleansed of Jews. It's Yudenrein, it's free of Jews. And who has moved in? The Kusim, or the Samaritans, who we mentioned in previous weeks, and sadly we'll have to talk about again, who are the new settlers of the land, and who make trouble, actually, for the Jews when they come back. So why is he cleaning bombers there? Answers the Radak, it's not true. by and large, the 10 tribes that were exiled, but not completely. There's never such thing as moving a whole population. Here and there were scattered settlements of 10 tribe representatives who remained in Eretz Yisrael. And when Eretz Yisrael was later conquered by Bavel, they reintegrated back into the Jewish people. And Yoshiyahu was clearing the bombers because he took responsibility for the whole of Jewish people, even those who were technically outside his kingdom. So the Radak says a very powerful thought. Two things. The first thing he says is that 10 tribes, they're still amongst us. We are largely Yehuda and Binyamin, but there are descendants, of the 10 tribes mixed in amongst us. This point, by the way, is made elsewhere by Tosfos on Shas. Tosfos says that the Gemara discusses whether the 10 tribes will come back or not, and according to the opinion that the 10 tribes will be lost forever, asks Tosfos, does that mean that the Jewish people will be incomplete? I thought we need the Shvatim to resettle Eretz Yisrael, and Shvatim will go everywhere, and he brings a chazal that Shvatim will never be wiped out. Does that mean they're really lost to Jewish history? And he says, no, the majority are, but there were minority that remains within the Jewish fold. It's also possible, by the way, that representatives of the 10 tribes, some of them fled to the Yehuda kingdom and were granted refugee status. They were the brothers and sisters of the Jewish people. It's possible that some had gone there earlier, because don't forget the Israel kingdom, Yisrael kingdom of the 10 tribes descended into idol worship way ahead of Yehuda. And there were presumably some Jews living there who didn't want to be part of this new pagan kingdom. Remember already Achov, early generations, Isabel, Achov, a whole mess of unfortunately distancing. So presumably some Jews ran away and came back to Yehuda. So there are representatives of all the Jewish people, and the Radak and the Malbim makes the point that when they resettled Eretz Yisrael, they went back there for if you look at the map, over the whole of the land of Israel. And this is perhaps hinted at in the Psukim on page 1. No, we'll have a look at the Psukim later. We'll leave that and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. The final point I want to make, which I find very meaningful and beautiful, is were all Jews exiled by Bavel? We just said from the Radak that when Sancherib exiled everyone, the first wave, the 10 kingdoms, some people remained. Did any Jews remain when they were taken into Bavel? And the answer would appear yes. And the Radak and the Malbim make this very moving point that as Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael, they found their long-lost third or fourth or fifth cousins by that stage, some of them in some of these villages where they settled. And again, I find that a very beautiful thing. When Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael, in waves, the Baalei Tosfos in the 1100s, the Talmidim of the Spanish refugees in the 1400s, when the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov and the Chasam Sofer in the 17 and 1800s, the New Yishuv in the 1900s and late 1800s. One of the beautiful things that happens is that Jews met their long-lost cousins, including a tiny Jewish community that had remained in Eretz Yisrael through all the generations, remarkably, and including Ashkenazim meeting Sfardim again and everything else. And the Radak makes his point, the Malbim makes his point, that there was a reuniting of these by now foreign Bavli Jews who had become very different over 50, 70, 100 years of Golus, and Eretz Yisrael Jews who had remained there, and in some ways had kept traditions going, but in other ways had lost Torah because they weren't part of a bulk Jewish population, and therefore had become distanced from Torah also. So that is chapter 2 of Nechemia, and unfortunately that's what we will cover for today. We will look next week in Mitzvah Hashem at chapter 3, and I've only used half my source sheet, so please keep these for next week, and we'll learn together chapter 3, which is absolutely fascinating, because chapter 2, to summarize, really is just the fact of return, the yichus, the genealogy, the attempt to resettle the whole of Eretz Yisrael, over-ambitious, it can't work when you have an average of 5 Levium for each city, people are going to cities. The beautiful, though, reuniting of Jews who have been apart from each other for the years of exile, and also perhaps even an attempt not just to resettle Yehuda, but even to resettle the whole of Yisrael. Next week, we will look at how do they proceed with this settlement project. And again, I think we'll see it has a lot of lessons for our attempts to rebuild Eretz Yisrael today. I wish everyone good evening, and in Mitzvah next week there will be a full hour-length Shir B'li Neder at 8 o'clock rather than a slightly truncated one today because of the Simcha. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Dayan Zobin.
Thank you.